Hello! In this video I'm going to talk to you about bar chords and inversions on the ukulele. But don't fret, it's going to be very simple because inversions are really just different versions of very simple chords that you already know. So, but they're all going to be bar chords. So what is a bar chord? Well, a bar chord is a chord where all of the strings have got a finger on. So there's no open strings ringing out. So a C is not a bar chord because it's got these three strings with no finger on them. So a bar chord, the first bar chord I learned was a D7, maybe you too. That's your first finger across all four of the strings on the second fret and then adding in your middle finger on the third fret of the A string. It's quite a nice chord. Now you may notice that the D7 chord reminds you in some ways of a much simpler chord you already probably know called a C7 chord, like that, which is just one finger in the corner there. Now the reason it may remind you of that is because there's just one finger in the corner of this chord, although this finger is doing exactly the same job as the nut is doing in a C7 chord. So it's effectively the same shape as a D7, just 2 frets down. So the nut, it's useful if we think of the nut, in the case of bar chords and inversions, think of the nut as a sort of invisible finger that sits there holding the strings down, allowing us to play the ukulele. So on our C7 chord, we don't need to put our finger there because the invisible finger's doing it. But then if we move it up a fret, then it becomes a C sharp 7. If we move it up one more fret, it becomes a D7 chord. And that's because every single fret on the ukulele is a semitone higher than the fret before it. So each one of these frets represents like a note on the piano keyboard. If you go up the piano keyboard, all the every note, including the black notes, in order, white, black, white, black, white, white, black, white, blah blah blah, then that's exactly the same as the fretboard. One semitone is each of those moves. So exactly, if we move one shape up one fret, it becomes a semitone higher. If we move it down a fret, it becomes a semitone lower. Now the other chord, the second bar chord I learned, was a B flat chord. A B flat you play like this with your 2 fingers here, your one finger covering those 2 strings there, your middle finger on the second fret of the C string, and your ring finger on the 3rd fret of the G string here nearest your nose. Sounds like that. Now this chord may remind you of if you think of this invisible finger coming up the back, it may remind you of an A chord, 1 fret down. These 2 frets are where we put our finger for the A chord. Now the nut there is doing the same job as our finger does in the B flat chord. If we move it down 1 fret, and because an A is 1 semitone below a B flat, if we move the B flat chord down 1 semitone, it becomes an A. Up a semitone, it becomes a B flat. Up another semitone and it becomes a B. And up another semitone and it becomes a C. So this is a good inversion to know, because this is a very complicated looking chord. It's actually just a B flat 2 frets up, but it's a C. Now you probably know a much easier way to play a C, which is like that, just with 1 finger on the 3rd fret of the top string. So, but now you know an inversion of that chord, which are different voicings of the notes. So a nice thing to do is if you're playing with somebody else who's playing a lot of C chords, instead of you just droning away on the same C shape, you can play your new inversion. And so in combination, the lower C chord and the higher C chord will sound lovely together, and they'll give it a totally different texture from if you're both just strumming away on a normal C. This works really with any chord shape. So an F you can do, you put your invisible finger, the invisible fret there, and then put the F shape in with your other fingers. Keep moving that up. F sharp, that's a G. You'll notice the little group of these three fingers are doing the same job as a normal G. An A flat, so on and so on. Inversions can also be really great ways to play tricky chords. There's a horrible chord which is the E chord, which often I get asked what's the best way to play an E chord. It's most often written like this, with your first finger there, and then you have to stretch your three fingers round onto the 4th fret on the 4 strings, on the 3 strings nearest your nose, leaving that one open. But that can be a real finger buster, that. So an easier way to play it is actually as an inversion of that chord. So if we think about the piano keyboard, very good if you just write it out and you can see the notes written out and go up one semitone at a time. If we start on a C, then we put our invisible finger comes into play, then it's a C sharp, then a D, another fret up, then an E flat, and then one more up and it's an E. So that's your finger across the 4th fret and then adding in that. So that looks a bit like a C down there, but we just move it up 4 frets and that's an E. That's how I play an E chord, and it means I don't have to be twisting my fingers around in a awkward, horrible way. So there's really experiment and have a little look, but hopefully you can see that the shapes up here are no more complicated than the shapes down here. It's just you're having to add in what the nut was doing, and as you move it up a semitone at a time, the name of the chord changes. We've got different ways to play an A7 all the way out the neck, so we can find different positions for different chords and make our strumming sound fancy as anything. So I'm just playing an A7 there, but it sounds like I'm doing much more than that. So remember, simple chords down here, you can turn them into different versions of those shapes using your finger as a bar, and move them up the fretboard. I hope this has made some sense and is going to be useful. Good luck with your plucking.